The DNA of Consciousness, An Introduction to Evolutionary Philosophy, Andrea Diem-Lane and David Christopher Lane. One of the central challenges in teaching evolutionary theory is deciding where to begin. Over the years, I have noticed that most undergraduates in my classes have only a cursory understanding of Charles Darwin and even less familiarity with the mechanism of natural selection. Typically, I also encounter a vocal group of fundamentalist Christian students who take Genesis literally and therefore believe God created the world in 6 days. Some accept an old Earth hypothesis, about 4.5 billion years old, while others maintain that our planet is only several thousand years old. In the face of this diverse mix, my husband David, also a professor of philosophy, suggested an approach that can reach students of varying beliefs and still effectively demonstrate, at least partially, the viability of evolutionary theory. His insight: whenever you present a controversial idea, start with common ground, what we already know and usually agree upon. To illustrate, I invite a student volunteer to join me at the front of the class. Let's say our volunteer is an 18-year-old named Sean. Then I pose a simple question. Why does Sean look the way he does physically? Apart from factors like clothing, hygiene, or personal taste, my students invariably answer because of his parents. No one really disputes the parental connection to physical appearance, but I press further. What exactly do his parents contribute? Naturally, the father, let's call him Christopher, provides sperm, and the mother, Catherine, provides an egg. Each is extremely small. The human sperm, head and tail combined, is about 55 microns, more than 25,000 times smaller than a golf ball. Here is where reductionism, a hallmark of science that is often misunderstood, comes into play. Sean's parents do not directly pass on their full-grown bodies, the phenotype, to him. Rather, they pass along genetic particles, the genotype. In scaling down from a 6'1" and a 5'4" body to sperm and egg, we are focusing on the arena where parental information is stored and shared. A useful analogy is to think of Christopher and Catherine as individual books containing historical information. Their wish is to merge these books and produce a new edition. Human sexual intercourse is the intertwining of two relatively large bodies, so that this important recombination of information can occur, and that child is essentially the intersection of two sets of genetic data. The big question follows naturally. In what language are these two books written, and how do they merge to compose the new one called Sean? Thanks to modern biology, something Darwin could scarcely have imagined, we know this code is in the form of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, which uses an alphabet of 4 chemical letters, C, T, A, and G, cytosine, thymine, adenine, guanine. Hence, Catherine and Christopher share a common genetic alphabet of 4 letters, forming tens of thousands of genes like pages, arranged into 23 pairs of chromosomes like chapters. Together, these make up the genome, the entire book. Sean is born of 2 genomes, recombined into some 25,000 plus genes, and 23 chromosomes, all encoded in DNA. Sexual selection is just one factor in explaining Sean's features. Had Catherine chosen a different partner, she could have generated a completely different son. Also, Sean is not simply a reconfigured carbon copy of his parents' DNA. When DNA replicates, copying errors, mutations, can occur. Sometimes this means a one-letter substitution. Instead of ATGGTTGATGTC, one might get ATGGTGGTGTC. Although such small changes can appear trivial, their impact in applied genetics can be profound. Why do mutations occur? It is a deep, but not insurmountable question, especially when we understand Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and the indeterminacy of quantum mechanics. Random chance events, mutations, introduce fresh variations in the genome, helping explain why a child can be unexpectedly distinct from the parents. There are 2 basic ways genes mutate. One is via environmental damage, for instance ultraviolet light, nuclear radiation, or certain chemicals, which can damage the base pairs so that G might pair incorrectly with T, creating what's called a translocation if broken DNA ends reattach incorrectly. The second path is through DNA replication errors. Before each cell division, enzymes copy DNA strands, and sometimes the copying protein, DNA polymerase, makes a rare mistake, roughly once in every 100 million bases. Repair mechanisms correct most errors, but some slip through. At this point, the class usually follows quite readily. Sexual selection and random mutation both affect the traits of children. However, they still find it mysterious how a 4-letter alphabet can produce such remarkable diversity. To clarify, I start with something everyone knows. The English alphabet consists of 26 letters, from which we get a vast array of publications, magazines, journals, newspapers, novels. Then I pose a question: what if we had only 2 letters, say 0 and 1, could we still produce comparable diversity? The students almost always assume that fewer letters must mean less complexity. But the reality is that with just 2 letters, binary code, we could reproduce every piece of writing in English or any other language. Our entire digital world, internet, computer programs, textual transmissions, ultimately derives from strings of 0s and 1s. W.V. Quine once joked that all we need are 2 symbols, a dot and a dash. In fact, a single symbol and its absence, the dot and the not dot, can suffice as a binary code. So the discovery that DNA's 4-letter code underlies the entire range of organic life makes perfect scientific sense. Still, while sex and chance explain much of Sean's uniqueness, they do not fully account for what Darwin was famously recognized for: natural selection. Darwin defined natural selection in On the Origin of Species. Owing to this struggle for life, any variation, however slight and from whatever cause proceeding, if it be in any degree profitable to an individual of any species, will tend to the preservation of that individual. The offspring also will thus have a better chance of surviving. I have called this principle, by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved, by the term of natural selection. Man by selection can certainly produce great results, but natural selection is a power incessantly ready for action, as immeasurably superior to man's feeble efforts as the works of nature are to those of art. Natural selection has been poorly misunderstood when people think it suggests nature consciously selects. A better term might be natural elimination, meaning that whatever endures survives by definition and propagates onward. It is not necessarily the best or strongest that survive, but rather the forms that happen to be sufficiently equipped to endure in a particular environment. We cannot ignore the monumental odds against life surviving in harsh circumstances. That anything survives at all testifies to the environment's challenges and the necessary adaptations that must have emerged. Those that live long enough to pass on their genes are declared successful, but only for a time. Environmental variables change, so the adaptation game is never static. As Darwin phrased it so eloquently, it is interesting to contemplate an entangled bank, clothed with many plants, with birds singing on the bushes, with various insects, and to reflect that these elaborately constructed forms have all been produced by laws acting around us. From so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been, and are being, evolved. Returning to Sean, 3 key factors have shaped his appearance: sexual selection, genetic mutation, and natural selection. Now think of your own case. Either you will produce offspring that continue your DNA, or you will not. If you do, you are in competition with countless others also seeking mates. If you do not, you have effectively said, "The buck stops here," ending the line forged by untold generations of survivors before you. Even successful reproduction does not guarantee a lasting lineage. A random mutation could be lethal, or new environmental threats, global warming, novel diseases, could wipe out your progeny. Nature's constant competition results in a form of relentless editing of the existing gene pool. Anything that endures has inescapably passed through this winnowing process. In this sense, Sean's genome, and yours, carries a story that stretches back millennia, shaped by innumerable events and conditions we can only glimpse today. Here, I usually ask Sean about his ancestry. Nobody in the United States is truly indigenous. Our ancestors came from elsewhere. In Sean's case, let's say Ireland and Germany. Even that isn't final, because genetic evidence suggests all humans alive today can trace their origins back to Africa, some 90,000 or more years ago. In that sense, we are all African Americans. Sean's very existence is the cumulative triumph of countless couplings, everyone in his direct genetic line successfully reproduced, generation after generation, never failing entirely. If any had, Sean would not be here. The same is true for all of us. Merely being alive is proof of an extraordinary success story. Contemplate how many strands of DNA never made it, how many sperm and eggs perished, how many organisms died before they could reproduce. The fact that you beat those odds indicates your genome possesses adaptations that proved sufficient to endure. You are, in a very real sense, a champion of survival, so far. This inevitably raises the question, how far back does our genetic history go? Most literalist Christians accept microevolution, small adaptations within a species, yet reject the idea of one species evolving into another. They argue that humans are unique and that the fossil record lacks enough transitional forms. To address this, I emphasize the scale at which evolution operates. It is molecular. When one focuses on DNA, microscopic strands of four-letter codes, the concept of species boundaries dissolves in the face of biology's shared alphabet. Once you concede microevolution can occur, you have, by default, conceded evolution itself, because the incremental changes we observe on a small scale, genetic mutations over time, accumulate into larger differences, eventually leading to speciation. But why don't we see the expected abundance of transitional forms? In fact, paleontologists find many, and it is remarkable that they have unearthed as many as they have. Fossilization is rare, requiring precise conditions, and active fossil researchers are relatively few. My husband, who loves Coca-Cola, draws an analogy to beverage can tabs. Over decades, we've gone from primitive pull tabs to the modern stay tabs. If someone 1,000 years from now wants to reconstruct this evolution, they'd struggle to locate every incremental stage, especially if most cans were discarded or destroyed. Kathleen Hunt, who compiles data on transitional fossils, explains that stratigraphic discontinuities and other geological factors produce major gaps in the fossil record. So we only have fossils for a small fraction of all species that ever existed. It is miraculous we have what we do. What truly cements evolutionary theory is the molecular evidence. As DNA studies expand, they offer extraordinary confirmation. Sean Carroll, author of The Making of the Fittest, and others have shown that accidental mutations, when they happen to confer an advantage, tend to be preserved, revealing the genetic story of evolution. In class, students often nod in agreement at this point, even if they remain uneasy with details. As Daniel Dennett underscores in Darwin's Dangerous Idea, evolution is a form of methodological naturalism, explaining phenomena via tangible physical processes rather than invoking transcendent or mystical forces. Dennett likens science to a reliable crane, step-by-step building upward, while religion operates more like a skyhook suspended from above. Evolution's power lies in its ability to explain so much so simply. In fact, Theodosius Dobzhansky famously said, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." This leads to the deeper philosophical question I raise in class. If natural selection explains why Sean looks the way he does, might it also explain why Sean thinks the way he does? The virtual simulator. In the distant future, I see open fields for far more important researches. Psychology will be based on a new foundation. Light will be thrown on the origin of man and his history. Charles Darwin. Why do we think as we do, or in more philosophical terms, why do we keep asking why? Humans have sought answers in countless ways, through religion, philosophy, and more recently, science and psychology. Charles Darwin, toward the end of On the Origin of Species, 1859, suggested that his theory of evolution would eventually revolutionize psychology by establishing how mental capacities arise through gradual, natural processes. Though evolutionary psychology has flourished, once called sociobiology, a parallel integration of evolution with philosophy has been more tentative, perhaps influenced by the poor reputation of certain 19th-century figures like Herbert Spencer, whose ideas of social Darwinism became controversial. Yet ignoring Darwin when analyzing consciousness and cognition leads to significant oversights. The emerging field of evolutionary philosophy, is less about prescribing future reforms and more about understanding why Homo sapiens engage in philosophical inquiry at all. If Darwin is correct, that every trait emerges to aid in an organism's survival or reproduction, then we must ask, how does philosophizing help us survive or reproduce? Answering this requires confronting the most intricate structure known, the human brain. As neuroscientist Patricia Churchland once said, we carry 3 pounds of glorious meat in our skulls. Remove that, and philosophy disappears. Any explanation of why we philosophize must begin with why consciousness arose in the first place. What adaptive advantage might self-reflective consciousness confer over the simpler instinct-driven awareness of other species? I wrestled with this puzzle myself, particularly while working as a research assistant to neuroscientist V.S. Ramachandran at UC San Diego. Once I realized that consciousness must be viewed in light of natural selection, my perspective shifted. A pivotal moment for me was a dinner party at Ramachandran's house, where I unknowingly spent nearly 2 hours chatting with Francis Crick, co-discoverer with James Watson of DNA's double helical structure. Ramachandran casually introduced him as Francis without mentioning his Nobel Prize. As we talked, Crick gently probed my beliefs on vegetarianism, Gnosticism, and Eastern philosophy, never once intimating his accomplishments. I even suggested that he might help in our lab experiments. Only later did I realize, with shock, exactly who Francis was. Crick encouraged me to delve into neuroscience because he argued understanding the brain is essential to unlocking so many other mysteries. Though I did not switch my graduate focus immediately, his advice stayed with me. My husband David, who also studied at UCSD, similarly pondered why consciousness might evolve. Observing our young son at play, David came home one day with an epiphany. Consciousness is essentially a virtual simulator, which helps us rehearse various scenarios in our minds without incurring real-world harm. In his diary, David wrote, "Everything we ask of the universe arises from our neural architecture. Philosophy is like heartburn, call it brain burn. Each deep thought is the product of neural confusion confronting its own dissociation." Consciousness is dissociation. This confers a Darwinian advantage. We can mentally imagine alternate scenarios, avoiding immediate physical risk. When these imaginary outcomes help us adapt, we survive. Consciousness is an internal film that can be creative or misleading, yet it remains integral to our evolutionary success. A dream world in the brain can be a survival tool if it offers insights on how to respond to real threats. Organisms lacking such a virtual simulator are forced to test options in reality, which can be lethal if a predator catches them on the first mistake. David had read Gerald Edelman's theory of neural Darwinism, which also views consciousness as a dynamic system of maps across billions of neurons. In essence, consciousness is a theater where we can project possible futures in safety before acting. Imagination thus fosters adaptability, but it also paves the way for illusions, errors, and delusions, side effects of a broad-based simulator. Freud, for all his faults, often stressed how the mind can rehearse or transfer patterns from our past onto new relationships, transference. Though Freud's methods are debatable, the idea of the mind replaying old maps for new challenges resonates with Edelman's concept of re-entry and second-order consciousness. Edelman draws a contrast between basic or first-order consciousness, simply being aware of external stimuli, and higher or second-order consciousness, reflecting upon those stimuli and manipulating mental models about them. Second-order consciousness confers a huge survival advantage because of its capacity for mental trial and error. If we accept that consciousness functions as a virtual simulator, the presence of bizarre fantasies or illusions, like those in dreams, makes sense. The simulator, when offline from real threats, can explore outrageous scenarios freely. The evolutionary payoff is that a fraction of these mental rehearsals help us respond more effectively when danger truly appears. At the same time, illusions can harm survival if they continually distort one's grasp of reality. Evolution thus demands some accuracy in our mental modeling. If early humans consistently misread the environment, they'd have been eaten or starved. So while our imaginations can run wild, we typically keep illusions in check through feedback from senses or from reality testing, as science does. In short, second-order consciousness, our introspective mind, likely emerged incrementally, correlating with more complex neural structures in mammals, particularly primates. Research in animal behavior, as Donald R. Griffin notes in Animal Minds, suggests that many creatures, chimpanzees, birds, even dolphins, display rudimentary problem-solving and perhaps simpler forms of awareness. Although human consciousness is more extensive, it lies on a spectrum. Why then do humans relentlessly ask why? If consciousness is a mental pivot foot, a flexible vantage point to rotate ideas, then why is the fundamental swirl of perspective, letting us shift mental vantage points to consider possibilities. It's the question that helps us discover new strategies. That is cognitively expensive, but also richly rewarding. Hence, the difference between religion and science can be understood through how each handles these simulations. Science fosters free invention of theories. Could the world be shaped this way? Then tests those ideas empirically. Religion typically enshrines certain imaginaries beyond empirical refutation, trusting them as absolute truths. As a result, we get thousands of religious claims across regions and cultures, but just one universal framework called physics, unbounded by place. Also, a virtual simulator can build robust beliefs that make life meaningful, even if they're factually inaccurate, as long as they help us survive psychologically or socially. Sometimes illusions or magical thinking can reduce anxiety and allow an individual to persist more confidently, perpetuating survival in harsh or chaotic environments. Neuroscientists often remark on the brain's capacity to fill in missing pieces, like the blind spot where the optic nerve leaves the eye. Our perception deceives us all the time to create stable images. Indeed, illusions can be evolutionarily beneficial if they foster quick, coherent responses. From an evolutionary standpoint, philosophy is another dimension of a broad mental simulator, fueling deeper reflections. Socrates famously said an unexamined life is not worth living. Put in contemporary terms, we might say that an unexamined life underutilizes the pivot foot of consciousness, ignoring the power of exploring varied what-if scenarios. Evolutionary philosophy. Evolutionary philosophy intersects neatly with what Paul and Patricia Churchland call inter-theoretic reductionism. Whenever we unearth a better testable explanation for a phenomenon, be it celestial mechanics or diseases, we abandon older myths and adopt new science-based language. Eliminative materialism suggests that just as we jettisoned Thor in favor of electromagnetism and evil spirits in favor of bacteria, so too must we revise our folk psychology about the soul, free will, and love in terms of neuroscience. Yet we've been slow to apply eliminative materialism to our own self-understanding. Even as we rely on advanced physics, medicine, and biology, we continue to use archaic spiritual or mythic terms for our innermost processes. The Churchlands argue that such reluctance stems partly from our discomfort at seeing ourselves as mere meat machines. Nonetheless, Francis Crick's astonishing hypothesis is that our sense of soul or self is ultimately neural activity. There is no separate metaphysical soul, just flesh and nerve impulses. Neuroscientist Carl Friston goes further, proposing a free energy principle, suggesting the brain continually tries to minimize prediction error. Building on Bayesian brain theory, Friston argues that the brain is fundamentally an inference engine, refining internal models to reduce surprises. When we apply that principle to consciousness as an evolved trait, it becomes clear that second-order awareness can flourish, especially when an organism isn't in immediate peril, when there's time to reflect. A pilot under attack cannot pause to do existential reasoning. Philosophy typically blossoms in societies that have enough resources, peace, and leisure for extended thought. Consider the basketball pivot foot again. You can't pivot freely when you're swarmed by defenders. Similarly, your mind can't pivot in free-ranging introspection when overwhelmed by immediate survival threats. Thus, ironically, devoting long stretches to philosophy implicitly indicates that one's basic needs are currently met. In summary, viewing consciousness through an evolutionary lens enriches our understanding of both biology and philosophy. It clarifies how sexual selection, mutation, and natural selection account not just for why Sean looks the way he does, but also for why he thinks as he does. Our minds, with their capacity to ask why and imagine infinite possibilities, evolved as powerful simulations to improve survival odds. Yet because consciousness can conjure illusions alongside accurate models, we remain vulnerable to superstition, myth, and error. Science, with its reliance on empirical testing, is our best corrective. Still, religion, philosophy, and art persist in part because illusions can comfort, unify communities, and fuel creativity. In the end, consciousness, this intangible theatre in our heads, represents one of nature's grandest experiments, shaped by billions of years of trial, error, and adaptation. And so we stand, ephemeral but wondrous intersections of matter, memory, and meaning, each of us a living testament to how DNA's four-letter code, multiplied across countless generations, can yield a mind capable of reflecting on its own origins and destiny. We carry not only the imprint of ancient Africa, but also the imprint of the universe's laws that forged us, and the virtual simulations we spin in our quest to uncover or create purpose.